Superman just became Darkseid in the newest issue of DCKO.
Peak fiction incoming.
So the Absolute Universe and Main Universe are sort of colliding in DC's latest event, and despite the first issue being nothing less than absolute insanity, the second issue is somehow even crazier because of so many different things. So without further ado, if you guys don't remember, the last issue consisted of Absolute Darkseid breaking into DC's main universe and terrorizing practically every square inch of Earth, because thanks to the amount of Omega energy he has now, he's able to be in multiple places at once. So he was able to terrorize the Bat family in Gotham, the Trinity in Metropolis, and other heroes around the world at the exact same time. However, before successfully conquering everything in sight, Time Trapper and the rest of the Quantum Quorum combined their powers to rewind time before Darkseid's arrival, where all the heroes eventually came to the conclusion that in order to defeat Darkseid, one of them would have to win over the Heart of Apocalypse by competing in a giant tournament where they'd all have to fight against each other. Unfortunately, as the tournament took place though, heroes like Shazam, Blue Beetle, and even Batman weren't so lucky to make it out alive, because whether they were impaled by an arch nemesis or blasted by a horde of Omega demons, in one way or another they were prevented from crossing the finish line. Nevertheless, when the first round of the tournament was all said and done, there were 32 characters and counting that ended up qualifying, but unbeknownst to them though, the Heart of Apocalypse claimed that there was actually a secret champion they'd have to compete against if they wanted to be crowned the King Omega, who ended up being none other than Darkseid himself, who was possessing Booster Gold's body. This issue on the other hand picks up during another moment in the past where the Trinity was playing board games together right before Darkseid invaded, and after exchanging some friendly banter about these revealing outfits that they wore in the past, Bruce expressed that they should play a game that was suggested to him by Tim Drake, where they predicted what each other's occupations would be if they weren't superheroes, and they also couldn't have the same jobs they have now during their normal lives. So Clark expressed that he believed Diana would have been a tour guide for national parks so they could see the beauty and humility in nature. Diana expressed that Bruce most likely would have been a doctor because that's what his father Thomas was, but when Bruce expressed that he believed that Clark would have been the president, initially Clark assumed that he was joking, but after realizing he was being serious, he respectfully disagreed, stating that he didn't have what it took to be president. Nevertheless, after that our story jumps over to present day, where all the contestants who qualified for the second round suddenly began appearing into a dark and mysterious realm with no clue as to what was happening. However, it wasn't long before the Heart of Apocalypse started speaking to them for the very first time, stating that the way Darkseid became the King Omega in the past was by taking power away from his fellow gods, so the only way that they were going to move on to the next round was by taking power from one another, because the arena that they were standing in was actually a graveyard where Darkseid left all the gods that he killed, and hidden within this graveyard were 16 powerful weapons from their universe that they needed to find. Some of these items included the God Killer sword, Thor's hammer, a bunch of different lantern rings, and even one mystery item. And once all the items were found, the challenge would end immediately, allowing whoever happened to be holding an item to move on to the next round, but whoever wasn't holding an item would be rewarded with nothing but death. What was even crazier about this challenge was that there was no rules of conduct. So because nothing but winning mattered, the players who followed the example of Darkseid would actually be the most rewarded. Nevertheless, moments later, the Apocalypse Heart finally emphasized that it was time for the round to spring into motion, so all the characters frantically spread out all over the place, desperate to find one of these items, but Superman on the other hand convinced himself that the only reason he was here was to prevent all the villains from securing an item, so he started going after as many of them as he could by blasting them with his heat vision before clasping onto Lex Luthor's leg and launching him into a giant skull. Meanwhile, somewhere nearby, Wonder Woman was going toe-to-toe with Etrigan the Demon because they were both going after the Atom's Belt, but after using a shield to avoid being struck by his fire breath, Wonder Woman used her leg to smash his jaw with so much momentum that he immediately fell onto the ground unconscious, but moments later when Giganta showed up, expressing that there was only enough room for one of them, she realized that she wasn't in the clear. However, it turns out that Giganta should have been the least of her worries, because then none other than the Joker appeared, standing right behind Giganta, revealing that he was already in possession of the Atom Belt and used it to massively increase his size. As if things couldn't get any more chaotic though, he then go on an absolute rampage by smashing Giganta underneath his foot despite being on the same side, before picking up Connor, Hawk, and Cheetah and munching down on both of their bodies. Meanwhile, Plastic Man and Metamorpho were also going toe-to-toe because both of them were trying to reach the God Killer sword. And it's here that Plastic Man indicated that Metamorpho didn't really stand a chance because his body was now constructed of a super plastic known as polyphenylene sulfide. But making it clear that he wasn't some sort of pushover, Morpho then reconstructed his body into a boiling hot version of the exact same substance, completely disintegrating Plastic Man's body in the process of doing so. But before being able to secure the God Killer sword, it was swiped up by the one and only Starro. However, in the midst of rubbing it in Metamorpho's face, it wasn't long before Starro realized that he spoke too soon, because in what seemed like the blink of an eye, the sword was stolen by Jay Garrick. Guy Gardner, on the other hand, was lucky enough to discover a Speed Force ring that was buried in the middle of a pile of rocks, but just before he could grab it and put it around one of his fingers, Harley Quinn effortlessly knocked him unconscious by smashing him with her hammer and securing the ring for herself. Superman and Lex Luthor, on the other hand, weren't even trying to find one of the items and instead were focused on settling their past disputes. So Clark uppercutted Lex into the air before clobbering him onto the ground with both of his fists, but as Lex lay there on the ground trying to regain composure, he then expressed that he wanted to thank Superman because after he trapped him in the Phantom Zone, he was given an epiphany. Uninterested in what that epiphany was though, Superman would then grab him by the throat and prepare to deliver yet another blow, but that's when Lex opened up a compartment in his chest, revealing that he had an entire collection of different kinds of kryptonite, causing Clark to fall to his knees while rapidly losing the strength to defend himself. And once he was weak enough, Lex would then express that whether he liked it or not, he was finally going to listen to him for once, before delivering such a devastating blow that he went flying through multiple craters. Also, what's stopping you from dropping a like and comment on this video? I mean, wouldn't that be super hilarious if every single person who saw this just decided to like and comment? I think that would be a great prank to pull on me. After that though, Lex finally began elaborating on what he realized during his epiphany, stating that he always thought he hated Superman because he was stopping humanity from realizing their true potential by constantly saving them from their failures, but now he was confident that he hated him because he wasn't doing enough. And then, making matters even more devastating, Lex would then reveal that he actually brought the Phantom Zone with him in the form of an energy blade before using it to slice off Superman's hand with a smile on his face. However, as Clark sat there on his knees, desperate for somebody to save him, Lex would then explain the final realizations that he had during his epiphany, stating that he knew that the Heart of Apocalypse gave Superman a vision of the future where the Earth was a paradise eradicated of corruption and disease, but because deep down Clark was nothing more than a coward, he not only chose to reject that vision, but planned on keeping everything the same if he ended up winning the tournament. And adding insult to injury one last time, he then blasts Clark's shoulder with a shard of green kryptonite before implying that he wished he had the guts to save the world, but he knew he never would. Nevertheless, once Lex flew away, we're then given a glimpse of Guy Gardner flying away with the Claw of Horus, but unfortunately, just like the Speed Force ring was stolen from him by Harley, soon enough the Claw of Horus was stolen from him as well after being confronted by Hawkman. After that though, we get a quick little glimpse of Swamp Thing, Wonder Woman, and Etrigan the Demon fighting for a weapon known as the Soul Taker sword, but the story then shuffles things over to Lobo, who happened to stumble upon a vest filled with venom, but immediately upon wrapping it around his torso, Starro came leaping into the air before latching onto his back, desperately trying to take the vest for himself. Unfortunately for him though, his efforts weren't enough because upon pressing the button that activated the venom, Lobo's strength was so overwhelming that he was able to latch onto two of Starro's arms before ripping them off of his body. However, despite this devastating injury, it wasn't long before Starro was not only completely regenerated, but multiplied into a bunch of smaller starfish that quickly started latching onto one face after another until being able to force different members of the Justice League to attack their fellow heroes and deliver him one of the items. But upon trying to force Wonder Woman to take down Zatanna, Zatanna used her magical capabilities to avoid being injured until realizing that Thor's hammer was right next to Diana's foot, so she tried getting through to her in hopes that she would realize that she could use the hammer to break away from Starro's grip, and luckily enough, when Diana viciously slammed the hammer on the ground, the impact was so overwhelming that every single miniature Starro was released from all of their faces. Nevertheless, after that we see Guy Gardner find yet another item on the ground, which actually happened to be the blue beetle scarab, but once again proving that he's the unluckiest man on Earth, it was then swooped up and equipped by none other than Jason Todd, who would then decide to use it to try obliterating Mr. J, but before the blast was able to find its target, both him and Harley Quinn were left disappointed because the atom belt that Joker was wearing allowed him to shrink to the size of an ant. However, even worse than him disappearing, we then see that for some reason, Big Barda was screaming in agony at the top of her lungs, and that's because the Joker was actually utilizing his new bite-sized body to tear at pieces inside of her brain. After that though, our story jumps over to Vixen, who just so happened to get her hands on the Thunderbolt pin, but upon crossing paths with King Shark, who began demanding that she hand it over to him, she was forced to use it in the most devastating way possible by summoning a giant megalodon that easily knocked him unconscious. As we keep trotting along though, we then see that the Godkiller sword eventually fell in the hands of Zatanna, but even though she was pretty much guaranteed to move on to the second round now, she was more concerned with the Legion of Doom finding the other hidden items. And that's when we see the infamous Lex Luthor speeding towards a group of various lantern rings, but to his misfortune, it wasn't long before Star Sapphire came flying in like a speeding bullet, it, smashing him with a construct that was modeled after the Fortress of Solitude in revenge for what he did to Superman. In a horrible turn of events though, Lex would then manage to use his newly crafted Phantom Blade to snatch the Black Lantern ring right off one of her fingers, which just so happened to be the exact ring that he was aiming for. But before getting to see how that pans out, our story then goes over to Supergirl trying to give Clark Psycho Pirate's mask, but that's when Captain Atom came blazing into the picture out of nowhere, decimating Supergirl with a massive punch that allowed him to take the mask for himself. However, upon getting back on his feet, Superman had to focus on an even greater atrocity, because it turns out that the reason Lex wanted the Black Lantern ring was for the purpose of reawakening the dead gods and using them to take down the heroes. But as he took down one hero after another with them, he then looked Clark directly into the eyes before asking him how he was gonna respond. However, our story then jumps back into the past again, with Clark expressing that Bruce was wrong about him being president if he had to be something else, because being a politician had never even crossed his mind. Bruce was certain that that was only because he was Superman though, stating that his point was that Clark was the kind of person who tried doing as much good as possible. He was a strategist just like him and Diana, but in his own unique way. And right now, because Superman allowed him to do as much good as possible, there wasn't a reason for him to figure out a new kind of math to continue helping others. But because things were constantly changing, there may come a day where this so-called new math was necessary. And that's when our story jumps back over to present day, with Lex and Superman continuing to stare each other down, but despite still experiencing so much pain thanks to the kryptonite and losing his hand, it's here that Clark realized that Bruce was 100% right about a new math being necessary. So he used every ounce of the little strength that he had to rip the kryptonite out of his shoulder, remembering that using Darkseid as an example would allow him to make it to the following round. But before he could make his triumphant comeback, Lex would then command one of the gods to crush him underneath its foot before asking him who the real Superman was. However, that's when Superman shocked everybody, including myself, just a few short moments later by not only getting up from his injuries seemingly unfazed, but revealing that Darkseid's powers were his now, because it turns out that the mystery item was actually the Omega Sanction. And with this newfound power, he'd then obliterate every single one of Luthor's dead gods by blasting them with Omega beams before finally confronting Luthor himself to confiscate the Black Lantern ring. But unfortunately, that's when Guy Gardner finally got lucky enough to secure the last hidden item, which ended up preventing Luthor from facing any consequences and also brought the second round to a close. Nevertheless, we then get a nice little page displaying all 16 champions that'll be heading into the third round, but it's here that the Heart of Apocalypse expresses that the game isn't only being played between them, because it was also being played within the Watchtower among the Quantum Quorum. That's when the story switches over to the Watchtower, with Doomsday implying that he was actually more hopeful that their plan was gonna work, expressing that all they had to do was continue holding the time barrier against Darkseid as the champions got closer to the center. But that's when the Darkseid possessed Booster Gold expressed that there wasn't a need for a new king because he was already there, before grabbing Doomsday by the throat and saying it was time that he enter the arena. But sadly, that's when this issue comes to an end. But if you guys want to see what happens next with DCKO, let me know in the comments down below.